At 4:41 a.m. on June 6, 1936, a rubber assault boat drifted in absolute silence just 600 yards off the reef near Tinian, its shadow swallowed by a moonless Pacific sky. Inside were 55 men the Marine Corps once labeled criminals, brawlers, thieves, fighters pulled from the brig and punishment details. Ahead of them waited 40,000 Japanese troops dug into the most fortified island America had ever faced. Want to know how these so-called criminals humiliated an entire Japanese division? Hit that like button, it helps this story reach more people. Back to the mission. At 4:44 a.m., as the Pacific tide whispered against the coral, Lieutenant Warren Rutledge raised a gloved hand, signaling the men in the rubber boat to halt rowing. No one breathed. No one whispered. Every movement was controlled, rehearsed, and silent. The surf around them was black, the sky starless, and not a single ship in the American fleet behind them knew exactly where this team was. That was the nature of the mission. If these 55 men died, no one would know until it was too late to help. These were not regular Marines. 6 months earlier, many of them had been sitting in brigs from Pearl Harbor to San Diego. Some had broken noses. Some had broken jaws. Some had broken the Marine Corps' patience. But each had one thing the Corps desperately needed, an instinct for survival. They were the men who didn't freeze when fists swung, who didn't hesitate when chaos erupted, who kept fighting even when every rule told them to surrender. And now, those instincts were all America had between 55 men and 40,000 Japanese troops waiting beyond the reef. Rutledge scanned the shoreline, a jagged silhouette of volcanic rock and black sand. Japanese engineers had spent nearly 2 years turning Tinian into a death trap. Pillboxes disguised as boulders. Tunnels carved into cliffs. Sniper posts hidden behind palm groves. Mortars pre-sighted on every possible landing route. And beneath all of it, an underground maze connecting artillery positions that no American intelligence officer had yet mapped. Tonight, that would change, if the 55 made it ashore alive. A slight splash broke the silence. Corporal Angelo Knifehand Carver, once arrested for carving his initials into an army sentry's shoulder during a bar fight, froze mid-paddle. Ahead of him, a Japanese searchlight swept across the reef line. The men sank lower into the boat, barely visible above the gunwales. The beam passed inches from their position but caught nothing. Rutledge counted the seconds until the light returned to its starting point. 27 seconds. That would be the window. 27 seconds to cross nearly 200 feet of open water, climb the coral shelf, and disappear into the jungle before the next sweep. The lieutenant leaned forward, voice barely above a breath. On the next pass. Stay under the waterline. No splashing. This was not a unit built on discipline. It was built on instinct, and now those instincts aligned into perfect, coordinated silence. The searchlight swept again. Rutledge hissed. Go. The 55 men slipped into the water like shadows. No clatter. No noise. Just bodies slicing through the surf as silently as sharks. Their uniforms were stripped down, pocket-sealed, rifles wrapped. Most carried nothing but knives, waterproof maps, light compasses, and demolition pencils sealed in rubber. Their guns would be retrieved after landfall from a cache hidden in a waterproof crate lashed to the stern. The climb onto the reef was brutal. Coral tore at knees and palms. Salt water entered cuts like fire. But the men moved with purpose, each one remembering the final briefing. If you are caught, we will not negotiate. You will not be rescued. Your only mission is to get the maps back to the fleet. By 4:57 a.m., they reached the top of the reef. Ahead lay a narrow strip of sand, then thickets of needlegrass and volcanic rock. Rutledge held up a fist. The men froze. Voices. Japanese voices. A patrol, close. He didn't order retreat. He didn't reconsider. This mission required moving directly through enemy patrol routes, not around them. The 55 men crouched low, waiting for the moon to shift behind a passing cloud. When it did, the world fell into complete darkness, perfect for ghosts, perfect for criminals turned reconnaissance scouts. The mission had begun. And if they did it right, the Japanese defenders on Tinian would have no idea their humiliation had started. They were never meant to fight together. On paper, these 55 men were the Marine Corps' problem children, the kind who filled brigs, broke regulations, shattered noses in fistfights, and stole anything that wasn't nailed down. Every Marine regiment had men like this, but only one commander looked at these troublemakers and saw not disorder, but raw, weaponized potential. That man was Major Elias French, a battle-worn veteran of Guadalcanal and Kiska. French had seen enough of the Pacific to understand one thing. Standard training wasn't enough anymore. Tarawa had proved it brutally. Hundreds of Marines had died not because they were outmatched, but because American intelligence simply didn't understand the terrain they were charging into. Machine guns hidden behind angled seawalls. Mortars pre-sighted on beach approaches. Trenches invisible from aerial photos. Cave networks that took weeks to uncover. French watched those men die and made himself a promise. We're never landing blind again. When he returned to Pearl Harbor to reorganize his regiment, he requested permission to form a specialized unit. Not scouts. Not snipers. Something entirely new. Amphibious reconnaissance and raider scouts, a pre-SEAL concept decades ahead of its time. To build that unit, French ignored the usual recruitment lists. Instead, he asked a simple question. Who are your most difficult Marines? Bring them to me. The recruiting philosophy, criminals over perfection. French believed something radical for the 1940s. A man who breaks rules is still a man who thinks for himself. And a man who fights dirty is the kind who survives ambushes, chaos, and jungle darkness. His selected candidates came from colorful backgrounds. Brawlers who'd been thrown into brigs for knocking out officers during drunken arguments. Thieves who'd stolen jeeps, rifles, food, and even boats. Dockworkers from Chicago who'd fought entire street crews alone. Fishermen who knew coastal tides better than most naval navigators. Boxers and wrestlers who feared no one. 2 former bootleggers who could steer a boat silently in pitch-black harbors. Knife fighters from Los Angeles barrios. A map-obsessed cartographer who'd been demoted after punching a lieutenant. A linguist with court-martial papers for gambling away marine supplies. A demolitions genius who got arrested for blowing up a latrine as a prank. Most units rejected these men. French sought them deliberately. He believed the best recon Marine wasn't the clean-cut poster soldier. It was the man who had seen violence long before he ever wore a uniform, the man whose survival instincts were older than his training. Training begins, 6 months of controlled chaos. For half a year, French and his hand-picked instructors molded chaos into precision. Their training locations rotated constantly. Camp Elliott, where they learned demolitions against mock pillboxes. Pearl Harbor Naval Yards, where they practiced underwater swimming using stolen rebreathers. Maui jungle ranges, forcing them to traverse ravines without making a sound. Night surf operations, launching rubber boats through violent waves without lights. They learned how to kill silently using knives or garrotes. Crawl through mangrove swamps without disturbing wildlife. Disassemble Japanese knee mortars and Type 96 guns from memory. Navigate reef lines in total darkness. Move 4 miles behind enemy lines and return undetected. Survive alone for 72 hours using stolen supplies. Call in naval fire using experimental waterproof radios. Their physical training was brutal, but psychological training was harsher. If you panic, the fleet dies. If you hesitate, the Marines on the beaches bleed. If you're captured, you don't exist. Weapons and gear, the prototype of future SEALs. Their kit was shockingly advanced for 1936. Rebreather rigs modeled after British SBS units. Camouflaged rubber boats. Waterproof demolition pencils. Cut-down M1903 rifles. Knives strapped to calves. Silk escape maps. Waterproof compasses. Thin-soled reef shoes. Coated grease markers for mapping artillery targets. Every item had a purpose: infiltration, escape, sabotage, or survival. How their reputation spread. As they trained, rumors spread through Pearl Harbor. French's Brigade of Criminals. The 55 Convicts. The Reef Rats. The Ghost Patrol. Other Marines mocked them. Officers distrusted them. But intelligence officers quietly pulled French aside. Your men might be exactly what we need. Their reputation as criminals didn't fade, but now, it came with respect. They were the Marines sent when secrecy mattered. They were the Marines chosen when others would break. They were the Marines trusted to map islands no one else could approach. By the last week of May 1936, French had finished forging them. They were unpredictable. They were dangerous. They were perfect. And now, they were heading toward Tinian, to humiliate one of the largest Japanese forces in the Pacific. The closer the 55 men moved toward their target, the more Major French's warnings echoed in their minds. Tinian and Saipan were not just islands in the Pacific, they were the doorway to Japan's inner defenses, the final stepping stones from which America planned to launch B-29 superfortresses straight at the Japanese homeland. If these islands fell, Tokyo would be within reach of American bombers. The Japanese Imperial Army knew that. And because they knew, they had transformed these islands into something terrifying, a fortress carved into volcanic stone, reinforced by years of brutal engineering, and manned by nearly 40,000 soldiers willing to die before surrendering a foot of ground. The terrain itself seemed designed to kill. Sharp coral ridges sliced the shoreline like the teeth of a saw. Inland, the ground rose into jagged ribs of volcanic rock, each ridge concealing spider holes, trenches, cave mouths, and bunkers invisible from the air. The Japanese had tunneled deep beneath the surface, building labyrinths of interconnected artillery chambers where crews rolled guns forward, fired 2 or 3 salvos, then pulled them back into the darkness before American counterfire could find them. Smoke vents were disguised as fallen trees. Machine gun slits were hidden behind thick ferns. Mortars were pre-registered on every likely landing beach. Every valley was a natural shooting gallery. Every path was zeroed in with overlapping arcs of fire. On paper, the island's geography was a nightmare. In reality, it was worse. American planners studying aerial photos could not agree on basic details. How many artillery tubes did the Japanese have? Where were their command centers located? How far did the tunnels reach beneath the island? No one knew whether the beaches were lightly defended or guaranteed slaughter zones. Without precise maps, the invasion fleet would be firing blind, and Marines storming ashore would walk straight into kill zones. Tarawa had taught the cost of ignorance, 1,000 Marines killed in 76 hours because they didn't know what waited behind the surf line. That was why the 55 men had been chosen. Their mission was not just dangerous, it was mathematically suicidal. They had to infiltrate the reef in darkness, slip through gaps in Japanese patrols, and move 2 to 4 miles into enemy territory, all while carrying nothing that could rattle, reflect light, or betray their presence. They had one purpose: find every hidden position the Japanese had prepared over 2 years of relentless fortification and transmit those coordinates to the fire control ships offshore before dawn. Battleships and cruisers waited with 14-inch naval guns loaded, but without corrections, they would be firing blind. The men in rubber boats were the eyes of the fleet. If these 55 failed, the Marines hitting the beaches in 2 days would die in rows. As Rutledge led them through the needlegrass, each step felt like threading a needle through layers of death. To their left, a series of volcanic ridges formed natural barriers, each one capable of hiding an entire platoon of soldiers. To their right, far below, waves crashed against coral shelves where Japanese spotters scanned for American destroyers. Ahead, faint lanterns glowed near an underground supply entrance. Every one of those lights marked a location that could annihilate landing Marines by the hundreds. The Japanese defenders were not simply well-trained, they were indoctrinated to fight until death. Officers drilled suicide tactics into their soldiers: nighttime tank charges, mass infantry waves, tunnel escape routes for last-second ambushes. They possessed detailed knowledge of the terrain, and they believed Americans could never operate effectively in total darkness. They were certain any infiltrators would panic and fire their rifles. They were certain Americans would stumble into ravines or trip over coral. They were certain no American unit could function miles behind enemy lines without shouting commands or showing fear. They were wrong. The 55 men moved like shadows stitched to the ground. Every one had memorized the night's tide cycles, the location of every coral head on their approach route, and the exact timing of Japanese searchlight sweeps. Their maps were blank sheets when they landed. They would be inked with enemy fire positions before sunrise. Each man understood the stakes even if no one spoke of them. If they were caught, they would not be taken prisoner. Japanese soldiers on Tinian did not capture infiltrators, they executed them and burned their bodies. If the 55 were discovered, their intelligence would be lost, and the invasion fleet would never know where to fire. Thousands of Marines would die on beaches designed to trap them. By 5:40 a.m., the recon unit lay in the grass overlooking their first objective, a series of faintly glowing vents rising from the hillside. Beneath those vents was the first artillery complex. And this was only the beginning. The Japanese believed the island was impenetrable. They were about to learn 55 criminals were here to prove them wrong. Dawn had not yet broken, but the sky had shifted from black to the faintest blue, just enough light to reveal edges, just enough to be dangerous. The 55 men lay across the crest of a narrow ridge, their bodies pressed low against the volcanic soil. Beneath them, warm air pulsed from the vents of an underground artillery chamber, carrying the heavy smell of gunpowder and sweat. Somewhere below, Japanese crews were preparing their morning firing drills, unaware that Americans lay only 40 feet above their heads. Rutledge motioned 2 men forward, Carver and Mendez. Carver, the knife fighter with hands like vices, and Mendez, who once escaped a 3-man ambush in Manila by jumping into a sewer and crawling half a mile. They descended toward the vents, each step deliberate, each hand movement rehearsed. Their job was simple but deadly: determine where the tunnel openings were, measure the angles of the smoke vents, and estimate the size of the artillery pieces inside. If they misjudged, the fire control ships offshore would fire short, and Marine landing craft would be ripped apart by friendly shells. Mendez knelt beside a vent, holding his palm over the rising heat. He mouthed a silent number toward Carver. The heat was too intense for a mortar or machine gun nest. This vent belonged to a large caliber gun, likely a 150mm piece, maybe bigger. Deep inside, they heard metal scraping, the thud of heavy boots, and the maneuvering of wheels on rails. Japanese artillery crews were rolling guns into firing position for the day. The clock was ticking. Carver produced a grease pencil from his belt and scribed a small coded mark on a rock near the vent. Simple. Quick. Invisible to anyone who didn't know the code. These marks would tell the Navy exactly which vents belonged to operational guns and which belonged to decoys. By 6:05 a.m., they had marked 6 positions. That was when they encountered the first Japanese patrol. It came from the north, a column of 6 men moving quickly, rifles slung low, their sergeant at the front scanning the terrain for signs of infiltration. They weren't expecting enemies here. They believed they were too deep, too fortified, too protected by the terrain. But they followed routine. Every morning at daybreak, patrols swept the ridges looking for anything unusual: fresh tracks, cigarette ash, broken foliage, discarded gear. And now, they were walking straight toward the 55 men. Rutledge flattened his body and signaled silence. No one moved. The patrol closed the distance, 30 yards, then 22, then 15. At 13 yards, the sergeant paused. He had seen something. A footprint? A bent leaf? A shadow that didn't belong? His hand tightened on his rifle. Carver moved first. He slipped from the ridge like a ghost sliding down a curtain. Before the sergeant even realized something was wrong, Carver's arm was around his throat and the blade was buried beneath the jawline. The sergeant made no sound. The second man in the patrol opened his mouth to shout, but Mendez was already behind him, hand over his mouth, cutting his windpipe clean. The rest of the patrol never even turned around. In under 8 seconds, all 6 Japanese soldiers lay silent, their bodies hidden beneath a tangle of brush. The ridge was quiet again. The recon unit resumed moving. They advanced along the slope, passing through thick needlegrass and jagged rock formations that forced them into single file. The terrain grew harsher the deeper they moved. Now they were entering the second ring of Japanese defenses, a layered network of trenches, communication lines, supply dens, and artillery pits carved directly into the volcanic hillside. No aerial photo had ever captured this place. No map had ever shown it. But the 55 men saw it unfold in real time, a highway of war hidden beneath the earth. At 6:40 a.m., they found their first tank revetment. 12 Type 97 Chiha tanks sat under camouflage netting woven with dried palms. Nearby, 25 Japanese mechanics worked in silence, preparing the tanks for movement, checking treads, fueling engines, loading ammunition, adjusting radios. The tanks were arranged along a sunken road cut into the hillside, invisible unless someone stood exactly where the 55 now crouched. Every tank had the range to roll straight toward the prospective American landing beaches. If the Marines hit those shores without knowing these tanks were here, it would be another Tarawa. Rutledge tapped his radio operator, a thin, tattooed kid named Harmon who had been arrested twice for breaking into Navy warehouses. Harmon had shaken off 2 courts-martial and once escaped a brig by climbing through a ventilation duct barefoot. Now he carried the most important piece of gear in the entire Pacific, a waterproof transmitter wrapped in sealed waxed canvas. Rutledge whispered, "Send it." Harmon keyed the transmitter. For 30 seconds, a soft burst of coded taps pulsed toward the fire control ship USS California, waiting miles offshore. 60 seconds later, the California responded. Correction grids confirmed. Coordinates locked. 12 tanks marked for destruction. The 55 continued moving. By 7:10 a.m., they discovered a supply tunnel long enough to drive trucks through. A cavern filled with stacked ammunition crates and racks of rifles. A hidden telephone exchange with operators speaking urgently. And farther south, more vents, more tunnels, more buried gun pits. Every one of these discoveries meant fewer Marines bleeding on the beach. Every coordinate Harmon sent transformed from invisible enemy strength into a burning crater. The 55 moved deeper still, past a narrow ridge shaped like a knife's edge. And as they scaled its spine, they saw something that froze every man in place. A massive Japanese formation assembling far below. Columns of infantry. Tanks. Trucks. Officers barking orders. Runners sprinting between units. It was a force numbering in the thousands, preparing for a night assault aimed directly at the future American landing zones. This was the moment the recon mission changed. They weren't just mapping the battlefield anymore. They were looking at the opening movements of a 40,000-man Japanese counteroffensive. And now the 55 criminals were the only Americans who knew. The question was no longer whether they could map the island. It was whether they could survive long enough to warn the invasion fleet. The sun had not yet risen fully, but the first hard light sharpened the edges of the battlefield below. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were forming up in tight formations, their officers moving through the ranks with clipped precision. Trucks rumbled in narrow, sunken roads. Tank engines growled in revetments. Artillery spotters climbed into concealed towers cut from the jungle. It was not a drill, not a relocation, not a defensive shuffle. This was the unmistakable rhythm of an army preparing to strike first. Rutledge lowered his binoculars. Every man around him could see the same truth. If that force reached the beaches before the Marines landed in full strength, the American invasion would be crushed before it began. The Japanese were not panicked or disorganized. They were preparing a coordinated assault using every tunnel, ridge, and kill zone on the island. The 40,000 defenders believed they were invisible. They believed no American could be watching them from this ridge. They believed they held every advantage. The 55 men crouching on the ridge knew better. Rutledge motioned Harmon forward again. The young radioman unwrapped the transmitter, shielding the antenna with his body. He tapped out the initial observation, enemy movement, estimated numbers, suspected route. The reply came faster than expected. Hold position. Track movement. Do not engage. It was the correct order from a distant perspective. But here, standing above an army in motion, the order felt detached from reality. These Japanese formations were not simply moving, they were mobilizing for a coordinated push directly toward the future American landing zones. Once they reached the shore, their tanks and infantry would hit vulnerable landing craft and supply depots with overwhelming force. Rutledge scanned the valley again and recognized something the commanders offshore could not see. The Japanese weren't advancing in a single mass. They were funneling into narrow terrain corridors, low ravines, dried creek beds, jungle cuts, believing these routes hidden. To a naval gunner firing from miles away, these corridors were invisible. But to the 55 men lying above them, each one was perfectly exposed from this angle. All they needed were coordinates and the right timing. Then Rutledge saw movement on the far slope, an officer carrying a map roll, gesturing at a complex of camouflaged ridge tunnels. A tank commander pointed toward the same tunnels, nodding sharply. Something was happening beneath the ground. The Japanese were using the tunnels to move entire companies unseen. That was the moment Rutledge realized the truth. The Japanese believed they had absolute control of the battlefield because they believed their tunnel network was secret. And that was how they would be destroyed. He whispered, "We mark the routes." No one questioned him. The men understood. They had one chance to turn the Japanese army's greatest strength, its hidden interior network, into a catastrophic weakness. They split into 4 fire teams, each carrying grease pencils, markers, and compass boards. Moving quickly but silently, they descended along the knife-edge ridge, marking boulders, roots, fallen logs, and dirt patches with coded symbols. Every mark corresponded to a pre-arranged artillery pattern the fleet offshore understood. They weren't leaving signs for themselves, they were leaving a death map for the U.S. Navy. The Japanese troops, preoccupied with forming up, took no notice. To them, the Americans were still miles offshore. No one imagined that the men they called criminals were carving the island's arteries into a grid of soon-to-be death traps. At 8:52 a.m., Rutledge reached the final marking point overlooking the central ravine where the largest Japanese formation moved. Hundreds of troops marched in staggered columns. Tanks rolled nose to tail. Supply carts groaned under the weight of ammunition crates. Officers barked orders with confidence. Rutledge crouched, took out his binoculars one last time, then pressed his thumb to the transmitter switch. Harmon waited for the signal. Rutledge whispered, "Send it." Harmon tapped out a coded burst, the last transmission of the morning. It carried only 3 words. "All routes marked." A long pause. Then, from the USS California far offshore, a single coded pulse came through. "Fire when ready." The air went still. Then the world broke open. A thunderous detonation rolled across the valley as a 14-inch naval shell screamed overhead and slammed into the first marked ravine. The explosion lifted bodies, trees, and dirt 10 stories into the sky. A second shell struck a tank revetment just as the engines roared to life. Armor plates peeled like paper. A third shell plunged into the tunnel mouth, collapsing the entrance and trapping an entire Japanese company underground. The Japanese officers screamed in confusion. Their hidden routes were suddenly exploding with impossible accuracy. More shells came, 5, 8, 12, each one striking with pinpoint precision no ordinary aerial reconnaissance could have provided. The 55 men had mapped the battlefield so perfectly that every Japanese assumption shattered in seconds. The humiliation was total. The Japanese believed their tunnels were invisible, now they collapsed by the dozen. They believed their tanks were hidden, now they burned in tight rows. They believed their infantry routes were secret, now they were death corridors. They believed their counterassault was unstoppable, now it disintegrated before even reaching the beaches. In less than 4 minutes, the Japanese lost more combat power than they could replace in weeks. The valley filled with smoke and screams. Officers tried to reorganize, but the tunnels they needed were buried. Runners tried to carry messages, but every ravine they entered erupted behind them. Tanks attempted to reverse, but their escape routes were cratered into twisted metal graves. It was not a battle. It was a dismantling. A systematic, humiliating collapse of an entire operational plan, destroyed by 55 men the Marines once labeled criminals. By the time the shelling stopped, the Japanese formation was broken, burning, and directionless. The surviving troops scattered into the jungle, their confidence shattered. Rutledge looked over the devastation. He knew what this meant. The Marines landing on the beaches would not be met by a coordinated Japanese force. They had just saved thousands of American lives. But the cost was now coming for them. Because every surviving Japanese soldier had seen the ridge the fire came from. And they were coming for the 55 next. The smoke still hung in the valley like a low ceiling when the first Japanese counter-response began. At first it was scattered gunfire, panicked, unfocused, desperate. But within minutes it transformed into something far more organized. Surviving officers rallied their troops, shouting orders that echoed through the ravines. Whistles trilled. Drums pounded. Messages were relayed up the slopes. The Japanese had no idea how the Americans found their hidden routes, but they knew the source had to be nearby. And as the smoke cleared, their eyes turned toward the ridge. Rutledge saw it before anyone else, shapes moving across a distant hillside, spreading in a wide arc. Soldiers. Many of them. They were fanning out methodically, searching for a way up. The humiliation of the bombardment had ignited a kind of fury. These weren't patrols anymore. They were hunting parties. "We move," Rutledge whispered. The 55 scattered into small teams of 4 and 5, slipping down the reverse slope of the ridge and into a narrow gully lined with volcanic stone. They moved fast, but not recklessly. Every man understood the reality: they had just crippled a Japanese division's counterassault. That alone painted a target on them. But worse, the coded fire mission confirmed to Japanese officers that American infiltrators were behind their lines. The enemy now knew the exact direction the shelling seemed to originate from. Within minutes, the first mortar shells began dropping along the ridge where the 55 had just been lying. The explosions tore through the needlegrass, shredding stone, leaving smoking craters where men had crouched only minutes earlier. One shell detonated close enough to throw 2 Marines to the ground. One didn't get up. Private Lewis, a former boxer with cracked knuckles and a crooked jaw, lay still, his chest unmoving. Rutledge didn't have time to mourn. None of them did. The enemy was closing in, and staying still meant death. They pushed deeper into the gully. The walls rose on either side like fortress walls, but the path was uneven, split by boulders and narrow chasms. If they moved quickly and silently enough, they might escape before the Japanese sealed off the exits. But then Harmon, the radio man, stumbled. Blood ran down his thigh. A jagged piece of shrapnel had sliced him during the mortar barrage. He managed to stand on it, teeth clenched, face pale. They needed him. Without the transmitter, they were deaf and invisible to their own fleet. Carver slung Harmon's arm over his shoulder and kept moving. Far behind them, the Japanese hunters were shouting to one another. They had picked up something: tracks, a broken rock, maybe the imprint of a knee. Whatever it was, they were following it. The sound of boots and scraping steel grew louder, more frantic, more coordinated. The gully forked. Rutledge paused, listening. One route led uphill into sunlight and exposed ground. The other descended into darkness toward what looked like a collapsed lava tube. "Down," Rutledge ordered. They moved into the tube. Inside, the air was cold and thick with moisture. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling. The passage was barely wide enough for a man with gear. Harmon had to be pulled sideways through one narrow seam. The tube snaked into the earth, twisting sharply until the entrance was out of sight. For a moment, all was silent, until footsteps and muffled Japanese voices echoed down from the gully above. The enemy was right over them. The men pressed against the cavern wall, holding their breath. Dirt fell from the ceiling as Japanese boots moved across the thin crust of stone above. The ground trembled. A soldier paused directly over the tunnel, his footsteps halting with suspicious weight. One wrong move and they'd be discovered. It took nearly a full minute before the boots moved on. Rutledge motioned them deeper. The tube sloped downward again, forcing the men into waist-deep water that stung their cuts. For 10 minutes they waded through blackness until the tube widened into a cavern lit faintly by cracks of daylight far above. But there was a problem: the exit wasn't on their side. A 40-foot cliff of slick stone stood between them and the mouth of the cavern. Climbing it meant exposing themselves. Staying meant being cornered and slaughtered in the dark. "We go up," Rutledge said. He climbed first, fingers finding holds no wider than coins. Carver followed, pushing Harmon upward with brute strength. One by one, the 55 ascended the stone wall. Halfway up, a distant explosion shook the cavern, Japanese grenades, thrown into the upper ravines as part of their search. Dust rained down. Rocks cracked. One Marine slipped, but Mendez caught his wrist before he fell backward into the water. When Rutledge reached the top, he peered out. The cavern mouth opened into a thicket of ferns near a shallow ridge, only 300 yards from friendly Marine lines. They could make it, if they moved now. The 55 emerged from the cave like ghosts reborn. They crawled low, slipping from shadow to shadow, until the first distant sound of American machine gun fire signaled they were near safety. But as they approached the perimeter, nervous Marines on the defensive line spotted movement. "Hold your fire," Rutledge shouted, raising both hands. A tense second passed. Rifles stayed pointed. Then a Marine sergeant called out the recognition code. Rutledge answered it instantly. The line parted. The 55 stumbled into friendly territory at 11:23 a.m., soaked, bleeding, sunburned, carrying their wounded, dragging their dead. But every one of them knew the truth. Their intelligence had saved thousands of Marines who would soon storm the beaches. They had shattered the Japanese counteroffensive before it even began. And now, after hours behind enemy lines, hunted, exhausted, they still had to face the cost. 7 men were dead. 5 wounded. 3 unaccounted for. But the mission wasn't over. The Japanese army was still out there. And the 55 had just made themselves its #1 target. By the time the beach landings began 2 days later, the story of what had happened on that ridge had already started to spread through the Marine ranks, but only as rumor. No one spoke the names of the 55 men who had crawled across coral in total darkness, mapped an entire Japanese division's hidden lifelines, and triggered the naval bombardment that shattered the enemy before the battle had even begun. Their mission was classified. Their success was credited to aerial reconnaissance and preliminary fire support. The 55 men slipped back into the shadows, battered and bandaged, carrying the weight of what they had done and the cost they had paid. Some of the Marines in the landing waves looked up at the burning inland hills and whispered, "Whoever did that, saved our lives." They never knew how right they were. When American forces advanced inland, they found collapsed tunnels, silent artillery pits, and charred tank revetments, each one marked earlier by the grease symbols of men once labeled criminals. But for the 55, victory had a price. The 7 they lost on Tinian were buried in temporary graves overlooking the sea, their bodies later returned home silently, without medals or speeches. The wounded carried their scars long after the battle ended. Harmon, the radio man, limped for the rest of his life. Carver never regained full use of his left hand. Mendez would wake up screaming for years, dreaming of boots walking across that thin crust of stone above the lava tube. When the war ended, most of them faded away. Some took factory jobs. Some returned to docks or farms. A few tried the police force but didn't last. Others drifted. The Corps had no name for what these men had done, no official record linking them to the naval bombardment that saved thousands. The mission stayed buried in classified folders and forgotten footnotes. The men stayed buried inside themselves. They carried invisible wounds before the world had a name for trauma. Many drank too much. Some shut themselves off from their families. Some never spoke of the war again. They had lived like ghosts behind enemy lines, and afterward, too many of them lived like ghosts among their own people. It wasn't until decades later, long after most of them had died, that historians studying early Marine reconnaissance stumbled across fragments of reports, coded transmissions, and unexplained bombardment coordinates. One researcher traced them back to Major Elias French's experimental unit. Old logbooks confirmed it. The mission was real. The 55 existed. Their mapping had altered the Tinian assault more than any intelligence group of the war. When surviving records were finally declassified, something remarkable emerged. Modern special operations analysts realized the techniques used by those 55 men, surf infiltration, night movement, underwater approach, ridge infiltration, tunnel mapping, target marking, were nearly identical to the methods later used to shape the Navy SEALs, Marine Force Recon, and special boat teams. These 55 men didn't just survive their mission, they pioneered a doctrine decades before America even had a name for it. What had once looked like recklessness was actually innovation. What had once looked like insubordination was genius. What had once looked like criminal behavior was simply the raw material for a new kind of warrior, a warrior who fights silently, invisibly, independently, and wins battles before they begin. They called them criminals. History calls them something else entirely. Pioneers. Ghosts. The ancestors of America's most elite fighters. And today, their story is finally being told, not in classified reports or forgotten logbooks, but here, carried by people like you who refuse to let their memory die. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It helps this history reach others who have never heard it. Subscribe for more forgotten stories of extraordinary courage. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, or somewhere else? And did any of your relatives serve in World War II? Every comment keeps these memories alive. Every share honors the men who went where no one else could go. Never forget them.